Mystery on the high seas, when vacation turns into horror. Introduction: The dark side of paradise. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a magnificent cruise ship, the sun warming your face as the endless blue expanse of the ocean stretches out before you, the gentle rocking of the waves beneath your feet, the sound of laughter drifting from the pool deck, the smell of salt air mixed with sunscreen and tropical drinks. This is the dream, isn't it? The promise of a cruise vacation, a floating paradise where all your worries melt away, where every need is anticipated, where adventure and relaxation exist in perfect harmony. For millions of people every year, this dream becomes reality. The cruise industry has exploded into a global phenomenon, with an estimated 31.7 million passengers embarking on voyages in 2023 alone. That number is expected to climb even higher, reaching approximately 35 million by the end of 2024. These floating cities can accommodate thousands of people at once, offering everything from gourmet dining to Broadway-caliber entertainment, from rock-climbing walls to ice skating rinks. They promise to whisk you away to exotic ports of call, to show you the world in comfort and style. But beneath the surface of this glittering industry, beneath the champagne toasts and the perfectly choreographed deck parties, there exists a darker reality. A reality that cruise lines would prefer you never discover. Because on these massive vessels, sailing through international waters where the laws of any single nation struggle to reach, people vanish, people are assaulted, people die under mysterious circumstances, and far too often, their stories are swept under the rug, their families left without answers, their cases left unsolved. The statistics are sobering. Over the past 2 decades, estimates suggest approximately 400 people have gone missing from cruise ships worldwide, though exact numbers are difficult to verify due to inconsistent reporting requirements. 400 individuals who boarded these vessels, full of excitement and anticipation, only to disappear without a trace. Some fell overboard. Some may have been victims of foul play. Some simply walked into the night and were never seen again. In many cases, their bodies were never recovered. Their final moments remain a mystery. And that's just disappearances. The number of assaults, sexual violence, and other crimes that occur on cruise ships is even more alarming. In 2023 alone, the FBI received reports of 131 alleged sexual assaults and rapes on cruise ships sailing to and from the United States. That's 131 people whose vacation dreams turned into nightmares. 131 incidents in a single year. And those are only the cases that were reported, only the crimes that met the threshold for mandatory disclosure under federal law. The actual number is almost certainly higher, much higher. Because reporting a crime on a cruise ship is complicated. Victims often face pressure from cruise line security to keep quiet. They're isolated, far from home, surrounded by strangers. They may be intoxicated or unsure of what happened. They may fear the repercussions of making waves. They may simply want to forget and go home. And even when crimes are reported, the investigation process is fraught with challenges. You see, cruise ships exist in a legal gray area. When a ship is in international waters, more than 12 nautical miles from any coastline, traditional law enforcement jurisdiction becomes murky. The ship flies under the flag of whatever country it's registered in, often a so-called flag of convenience nation like the Bahamas or Panama, countries chosen for their lax regulations and favorable tax structures rather than their robust investigative capabilities. When a crime occurs, determining who has the authority to investigate, who has the power to prosecute, and what laws even apply becomes an exercise in bureaucratic confusion. The FBI can investigate crimes involving American citizens or on ships that call on United States ports, but even then, they face significant obstacles. By the time they're notified, the ship may have already docked in multiple foreign ports. Witnesses have disembarked. Evidence has been contaminated or disposed of. The scene has been cleaned. The trail has gone cold. And cruise lines, conscious of their corporate image and bottom line, are not always as cooperative as one might hope. This is the world we're entering today. A world where the promise of paradise can transform into horror in the blink of an eye, where the vastness of the ocean offers not just beauty and tranquility, but also the perfect hiding place for terrible secrets. Where the very isolation that makes cruising feel like an escape from the world also makes it the ideal environment for crimes that might never be solved. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to explore some of the most haunting mysteries to ever unfold on the high seas. We'll examine cases that have captured international attention, that have sparked legislative reform, that have left families desperately seeking answers that may never come. We'll look at the systemic issues that allow these crimes to occur and often go unpunished. We'll dive into the complex web of maritime law and international jurisdiction. And we'll confront the uncomfortable truth that the cruise industry, despite its carefully cultivated image of safety and luxury, has a dark underbelly that it works very hard to keep hidden from the traveling public. These are stories of ordinary people who embarked on what should have been the vacation of a lifetime. People like Amy Lynn Bradley, a vivacious 23-year-old who disappeared from her family's cruise in 1998 and has never been found. People like George Smith IV, a newlywed who vanished from his honeymoon cruise under suspicious circumstances that his family believes involved foul play. People like Rebecca Coriam, a Disney cruise worker whose disappearance sparked allegations of inadequate investigation. People like Merrian Carver, whose case launched a crusade for cruise ship safety reform. Each of these individuals had hopes and dreams. They had families who loved them. They had entire lives ahead of them. And then they stepped aboard a cruise ship and everything changed. Their stories are tragic. They're frustrating. They're infuriating. But they're also important. Because by bringing these cases to light, by refusing to let them fade into obscurity, we honor the victims and we fight for the changes that might prevent future tragedies. So, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a journey into the dark heart of the cruise ship industry. This is Mystery on the High Seas, when vacation turns into horror. The disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley. Let's begin with a case that has become perhaps the most infamous cruise ship disappearance in history, the case of Amy Lynn Bradley. It was March 1998, and the Bradley family was living their best life. Ron and Iva Bradley, along with their two adult children, Brad and Amy, had boarded the Royal Caribbean cruise ship Rhapsody of the Seas for a week-long Caribbean voyage. It was supposed to be a fun family vacation, a chance to relax and bond and create lasting memories together. The Rhapsody of the Seas was practically brand new at the time, having just been launched a year earlier. It was state-of-the-art, luxurious, promising the kind of experience that cruise lines love to advertise in their glossy brochures. Amy Lynn Bradley was 23 years old, a recent college graduate with her entire future stretching out before her. She was described by everyone who knew her as vivacious, independent, and full of life. She had a distinctive appearance with several tattoos, including a Tasmanian devil on her shoulder, a sun on her lower back, and a gecko lizard on her left ankle. She was attractive, outgoing, the kind of person who made friends easily and lit up a room when she walked in. The cruise had been wonderful. The family had visited Aruba, one of the stops on their Caribbean itinerary, and everyone was having a great time. On the evening of March 23rd, the ship docked in Curaçao, and Amy spent the evening enjoying the nightlife aboard the ship. She went to the disco, she danced, she had some drinks. She was seen interacting with members of the ship's band, a group called Blue Orchid. According to one of the band members, Amy shared a drink with them after their set ended, and they chatted for a while. Then, around 1 in the morning, on March 24th, Amy said she was heading off on her own. The ship's door lock system recorded Amy returning to her family's cabin at 3:40 in the morning. Her father, Ron, woke up around 5:30 and stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air. He looked over and saw Amy sleeping on a deck chair on the balcony, apparently having chosen to sleep outside rather than in her bed. He didn't disturb her. It was early. She was clearly tired, and there was no reason to worry. She was safe. She was right there, just a few feet away. He went back inside and went back to sleep himself. But when Ivor Bradley woke up at 6 in the morning and went to check on Amy, she was gone. The deck chair was empty. Amy was nowhere to be found. At first, the family assumed she must have gotten up and gone somewhere on the ship. Maybe she couldn't sleep and went to get breakfast. Maybe she went to the gym. Maybe she just wanted to watch the sunrise from a different vantage point. But as the morning wore on, and Amy didn't return, and didn't answer when they called her name, the family's concern grew into alarm. They alerted the ship's crew. They asked if an announcement could be made over the ship's PA system, asking Amy Bradley to report to a specific location. But the purser's office told them it was too early to make such an announcement, that it would disturb the other passengers. They were told to wait until 7:50 in the morning, after most passengers had disembarked for their excursions in Curaçao. The family waited, increasingly frantic, watching precious minutes tick by. When the announcement was finally made, it simply said, "Will Amy Bradley please come to the purser's desk?" There was no response, no sign of Amy anywhere. Between 12:15 and 1 in the afternoon, the cruise staff conducted a thorough search of the ship. They checked every public area, every accessible space. Nothing. Amy Lynn Bradley had vanished. The Netherlands Antilles Coast Guard was notified and began a 4-day search of the surrounding waters. Royal Caribbean even chartered a boat to continue searching after the Coast Guard suspended their efforts. Helicopters scoured the area. A radar plane assisted in the search. But Amy was never found. Not a trace of her. Not a piece of clothing. Not a personal belonging. Nothing. In the immediate aftermath, authorities speculated that Amy had either fallen overboard accidentally or had died by suicide, but her family vehemently rejected both theories. Amy was a trained lifeguard, a strong swimmer. She had no reason to be suicidal. She was happy, excited about her future, close to her family. The idea that she would take her own life made no sense to those who knew her. And if she had fallen overboard, surely there would have been some sign of it. A splash loud enough to wake nearby passengers, security footage of her going over the rail. Something. But there was nothing. Nothing except a series of increasingly disturbing events that would unfold in the years to come. Events that suggested Amy's disappearance might not have been an accident at all. The first strange occurrence happened soon after Amy vanished. A man named Brad, Amy's brother, reported that one of the members of Blue Orchid, the ship's band, approached him shortly after Amy's disappearance became known. The band member, whose name was Alistair Douglas, known as Yellow, said something along the lines of, "Hey man, I'm sorry to hear about your sister." But here's the thing, no announcement about Amy being missing had been made at that point. No one outside the immediate family and ship staff should have known. So how did Douglas know? When Brad pointed this out, Douglas's explanation was vague and unsatisfying. Douglas later denied any wrongdoing, and a polygraph test administered by the FBI was inconclusive. He has never been charged with any crime, and the nature of his relationship with Amy, if any, remains unclear. Then, there was the matter of the ship's photographer. Throughout a cruise, professional photographers take countless pictures of passengers, which are then printed out and displayed in a gallery for passengers to purchase as souvenirs. The Bradley family noticed that while there were photos of other passengers all over the display, there didn't seem to be any photos of Amy from this particular cruise. Every photo that might have captured Amy appeared to be missing. The family believed these photos had been deliberately removed, though by whom and why remains unknown. There was also a cabin attendant, a waiter, who had repeatedly tried to pass notes to Amy during the cruise. The notes reportedly contained invitations for Amy to go drinking with him once they reached shore. Some people have speculated that this waiter might have had something to do with Amy's disappearance, though there's no concrete evidence to support this theory. But the most disturbing development came in the form of reported sightings. In the months and years following Amy's disappearance, multiple people claimed to have seen her in various locations around the Caribbean. About a month after she vanished, the Bradley family traveled to Curaçao to continue searching for Amy. While they were there, they were approached by a cab driver who said he had seen Amy on March 24th, the day she went missing. He claimed she was in the area where the cruise ship had docked, that she appeared to be running through a parking lot looking for a phone. He said he specifically remembered her green eyes and recognized her from the reward posters the family had put up. The cab driver also claimed to have seen Amy in other locations on the island after that initial sighting, always with men who seemed to be controlling her movements. His descriptions were detailed and specific, and he seemed genuinely concerned about what he had witnessed. But despite these reports, no physical evidence of Amy's presence in Curaçao was ever found. Then, in January 1999, more than 9 months after Amy disappeared, a Navy sailor named David Carmichael reported an encounter that would send chills through anyone following the case. Carmichael was on shore leave in Curaçao when, he claimed, he was approached by a woman in a brothel who said her name was Amy Bradley and that she was from Virginia. The woman reportedly told Carmichael that she needed help, that she was being held against her will. Before he could react or get more information, she was pulled away by men who appeared to be her handlers. Carmichael didn't immediately report this encounter because he was in a compromising situation himself, being in a brothel while on duty. But when he finally did come forward years later, his story matched many of the known details about Amy. The woman he described had the right age, the right appearance, even some of the distinctive tattoos that Amy had. The FBI investigated his claims but was unable to corroborate his story or locate the woman he described. In March 2005, a woman named Judy Mora claimed to have seen a woman resembling Amy in a department store restroom in Bridgetown, Barbados. Mora, a Canadian tourist, said she approached the woman and asked if she needed help. The woman reportedly whispered yes, but then men quickly appeared and escorted her away before any further interaction could take place. Perhaps most intriguingly, in 2004, a member of the United States military reported seeing a woman resembling Amy in a photograph on an adult website. The FBI investigated and found that the photos in question had been taken in the Caribbean region and showed a woman with similar physical characteristics to Amy, including what appeared to be similar tattoos. But the photos were too blurry and had been manipulated in ways that made positive identification impossible. The website where the photos appeared was traced back to the Caribbean, but the trail went cold there. Over the years, the FBI has continued to investigate Amy's disappearance, treating it as a possible abduction and human trafficking case. The agency has offered rewards for information leading to Amy's whereabouts, and the case has been featured on numerous television programs, including Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted. In July 2025, a 3-part documentary series titled Amy Bradley is Missing was released on Netflix, bringing renewed attention to the case. Shortly after, podcast host Ethan Klein announced on the H3 podcast that he would offer a $1 million reward for any information or actions leading to Amy being safely returned home. But despite all this attention, all these investigations, all these reported sightings, Amy Lynn Bradley has never been found. The question of what happened to her remains unanswered. Based on what we know, several scenarios remain possible. While she was a strong swimmer, an accidental fall can't be entirely ruled out, though her swimming ability makes this less probable. The FBI has stated there's no evidence suggesting suicide, and those who knew her well say she had no apparent reason to take her own life. This leads investigators toward more disturbing possibilities: abduction, potentially by someone connected to the cruise ship's crew, or perhaps being forced into human trafficking, as some of the sightings might suggest. The human trafficking theory is particularly disturbing to consider. The Caribbean has long been identified as a region where sex trafficking operations exist, and the islands that serve as cruise ship ports are not immune to this criminal activity. When we examine the pattern of sightings, a woman appearing to be controlled by men, the reported encounter in a brothel, the alleged photos on adult websites, these details have led investigators to consider the possibility that Amy may have been abducted from the ship and forced into trafficking. The FBI's continued treatment of this as a potential abduction case suggests they find this theory credible, even without definitive proof. The logistics of such an abduction raise difficult questions. If members of the ship's crew were involved, as the Bradley family suspects, we can infer it would have required careful planning. The family's cabin was not isolated. There were other cabins nearby, other passengers who might have heard something unusual. If Amy was taken off the ship in Curaçao, the abductors would have needed to bypass crew members, security protocols, and the general vigilance of other passengers. The apparent success of such an operation, if it occurred, suggests either remarkable luck or inside knowledge of the ship's security gaps. These questions have tormented the Bradley family for more than 2.5 decades. Ron and Ivor Bradley have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on private investigators, on reward money, on keeping Amy's case in the public eye. They've endured countless false leads and dead ends. They've had to live with the horrifying possibility that their daughter might still be alive somewhere, trapped in circumstances too awful to fully contemplate. Brad Bradley has spoken publicly about the trauma of not knowing, of having hope continually dangled in front of him only to be snatched away. The FBI has stated that there is no evidence to suggest Amy fell overboard or died by suicide. They've said that while they can't definitively prove she was abducted, the circumstances of her disappearance and the subsequent sightings suggest that abduction is a viable theory. The case remains open and active. But as the years pass, as Amy would now be approaching 50 years old, if she's still alive, the likelihood of ever finding answers grows dimmer. The Bradley family has never given up hope. They continue to maintain a website with information about Amy's case, continue to share her story, continue to plead for anyone with information to come forward. They want to know what happened to their daughter. They want to be able to lay her to rest, whether literally or figuratively. They want justice for Amy. They want closure. But more than that, they want to ensure that what happened to Amy doesn't happen to anyone else. They've been vocal critics of the cruise industry's handling of disappearances and crimes. They've pointed out the delays in the ship's response to Amy's disappearance. They've questioned why the ship was allowed to continue on its route, disembarking passengers in Curaçao and taking on new passengers, rather than being detained while a proper investigation was conducted. They've highlighted how this allowed potential witnesses and even potential suspects to scatter to the winds, making the investigation exponentially more difficult. Amy's case has become a rallying cry for cruise ship safety reform. It's been cited in congressional hearings. It's been used as an example of everything that can go wrong when a crime occurs in the jurisdictional no man's land of international waters. It's a stark reminder that when you board a cruise ship, you're entering an environment where the normal rules don't always apply, where help may be hours or days away, where the company's priorities may not always align with your safety. And at the heart of this case, beyond all the speculation and theories and unanswered questions, is a young woman who should be here. Amy Lynn Bradley should have celebrated her 50th birthday. She should have built a career, maybe gotten married, maybe had children of her own. She should have lived. But on that March morning in 1998, something happened to her. Something that has haunted her family and captivated the public for more than 25 years. Something that may never be fully understood. Amy's disappearance is a mystery wrapped in tragedy. It's a case that refuses to be forgotten. A story that demands answers, even as those answers remain frustratingly out of reach. And it's just one of many such cases that have unfolded on cruise ships over the years. Amy Lynn Bradley may be the most famous victim, but she is far from the only one. The death of George Smith IV on his honeymoon. If Amy Lynn Bradley's case is a story of mysterious disappearance and possible abduction, then the case of George Allen Smith IV is a story of something darker and more violent. This is a story of a honeymoon that ended in blood, of a death under suspicious circumstances that his family believes was murder, and of a justice system that has so far failed to hold anyone accountable. George Allen Smith IV came from a prominent family in Greenwich, Connecticut. He was 26 years old in the summer of 2005, a young man with a bright future ahead of him. He worked at his family's liquor store in Cos Cob, and by all accounts, he was well-liked, friendly, and excited about the next chapter of his life. Because just days before, on June 25, 2005, George had married Jennifer Hagel in a beautiful cliffside ceremony in Newport, Rhode Island. It was, according to George's older sister Bree, a storybook wedding. The venue overlooked the ocean, the weather was perfect, and the couple was radiantly happy. George and Jennifer had been together for 3 years before getting married. They were in love, excited to start their lives together, thrilled about the honeymoon cruise they had planned. 10 days after their wedding, they would board the Royal Caribbean cruise ship Brilliance of the Seas for a 2-week Mediterranean cruise, visiting Greece, Turkey, and Italy. It was meant to be romantic, adventurous, the trip of a lifetime. The early part of the cruise went well. George and Jennifer made friends with other honeymooners on board, including a couple named Paul and Galina Kvitniski. The Kvitniskis later described George and Jennifer as normal, down-to-earth, happy people who seemed excited about their future together. But on the night of July 4th, going into the early morning hours of July 5th, something went terribly wrong. That evening, the ship was sailing through the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. George and Jennifer spent the night drinking and gambling in the ship's casino. They were having a good time, enjoying the festivities. At some point during the night, they met a group of young men, and the group began drinking together. These men would later become the focus of intense scrutiny in the investigation that followed. The night wore on. George continued drinking heavily. According to various accounts from passengers and crew members, by the early morning hours, George was extremely intoxicated. Jennifer was also quite drunk. The exact sequence of events is unclear, as memories are hazy and accounts conflict, but at some point, Jennifer was found passed out in a hallway of the cruise ship. She was taken to the ship's medical center. Meanwhile, George was last seen entering his cabin with some of the young men he'd been drinking with. And then, around 4:30 in the morning, passengers in nearby cabins heard disturbing sounds. There was arguing coming from the Smith's cabin, loud, angry voices. Then there was the sound of furniture being moved, and then a loud thud. Some passengers described it as a bang or a crash. It was significant enough that multiple people noticed it. The next morning, passengers on a lower deck made a gruesome discovery. There was a large, unmistakable blood stain on the canopy of a lifeboat directly below the Smith's balcony. The blood had clearly come from above, from the area where the Smith's cabin was located. When crew members entered the cabin, they found it in disarray. There were small traces of blood on the bedsheets, and George Smith IV was nowhere to be found. The ship's captain quickly declared the situation an accident. He suggested that George, heavily intoxicated, had fallen from his balcony into the sea. But George's family has never believed this explanation, and for good reason. Because the evidence from that morning tells a very different story. First, there's the blood itself. The amount of blood found on the lifeboat canopy was significant, and it was clearly George's blood. But if George had simply stumbled over the balcony railing while drunk, would there have been that much blood? And where did it come from? The blood pattern suggested that George had been bleeding from the head before he went over the rail. Then there's the balcony furniture. A chair was found with its back pushed up against the railing. Some investigators have suggested this indicates George may have stood on the chair and fallen, but others point out that this positioning looks more like someone tried to push or lift a body over the railing and needed the chair for leverage. There's also the question of the 4-fingered bloody handprint that was found on the ship's edge, right where it appears George had been holding on before he fell into the water. Was this George's handprint, desperately trying to hold on? Or was it someone else's, someone who had pushed him? And then there are those sounds that passengers heard. The arguing, the furniture moving, the loud thud. These are not the sounds of someone accidentally falling. These are the sounds of violence, of a struggle, of something very bad happening. Perhaps most damningly, there's the matter of the young men who were with George that night. 4 men in particular were identified as having been among the last to see George alive. Their names, Josh Askin, and 3 Russian-American passengers named Greg and Zach Rosenberg. and Rusty Kaufman. These 4 men were questioned by authorities but have never been charged with any crime related to George's death. They had been drinking with George in the casino, and they accompanied him back to his cabin in the early morning hours. They were in the cabin, or at least nearby, when those disturbing sounds occurred. When the FBI began investigating, they tried to interview these men. Josh Askin was called for a deposition as part of the civil lawsuit that would eventually be filed. His lawyer had him invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination repeatedly, not just on substantive questions about what happened that night, but on basic questions about his identity. When asked his name, Askin invoked the Fifth. When asked his date of birth, Askin invoked the Fifth. He took the Fifth Amendment more than 100 times during the deposition. The FBI investigated the 3 Russian-American passengers as well. In 2006, a video surfaced that had been recorded by one of them just hours after George's disappearance. In the video, the men appear to be joking about George's death. At one point, one of them stands up, hunches his shoulders, and flashes gang signs. The men are laughing, seemingly unconcerned, decidedly not acting like people who had just witnessed a tragic accident involving an acquaintance. The FBI obtained this video as evidence, but to this day, none of these men have been charged with any crime. The investigation has been plagued with problems from the beginning. By the time the FBI was notified and able to begin their investigation, the ship had already stopped at multiple ports. Passengers had disembarked. New passengers had boarded. The cabin had been cleaned. Potential evidence had been lost or contaminated. Crucial interviews that should have been conducted immediately were delayed by days. The jurisdictional issues complicated everything. Because the ship was in international waters when George disappeared, and because the brilliance of the seas is registered in the Bahamas, the Bahamian authorities technically had jurisdiction. But they showed little interest in conducting a thorough investigation. The FBI eventually took over, but by then the trail had gone cold. They investigated the case for nearly a decade, but in January 2015, they announced they were closing the investigation. They told the Smith family that there was not enough evidence to prove George had been murdered, and that his death may have been the result of an accident. The Smiths were outraged and disgusted. They continued to believe, based on the evidence, that their son was murdered, and they have never stopped fighting for justice. George's widow, Jennifer, has been a controversial figure in the aftermath. Some people, particularly George's family, have criticized her conduct on the night of his disappearance and in the days that followed. She was drunk and passed out in a hallway when George vanished. She later couldn't account for her whereabouts during a crucial period of time. In 2006, she accepted a settlement of $1.1 million from Royal Caribbean, which some saw as her trying to quickly cash in on George's death and move on. The settlement was later increased to $1.3 million, with the additional funds split between Jennifer and the Smith family. Jennifer has consistently maintained that she had no involvement in George's death and believes it was a tragic accident. She has since remarried and has been reluctant to discuss the case publicly. Jennifer has maintained that she believes George's death was an accident caused by his intoxication. She's suggested that the Smith family refuses to acknowledge George's alcohol and prescription drug use, which may have impaired his judgment and coordination. But George's family points out that even if George was drunk, that doesn't explain the blood in the cabin, the sounds of fighting, the suspicious behavior of the 4 men who were with him. It doesn't explain why those men have refused to cooperate with investigators. It doesn't explain the video of them joking about his death. The Smith family has offered a $100,000 reward for information leading directly to an arrest and conviction in George's case. They've appeared on numerous television programs, including 48 Hours and Dateline NBC. They've testified before Congress about the need for better safety regulations and investigative procedures for crimes on cruise ships. They've sued Royal Caribbean, though that case was eventually settled. They've done everything in their power to keep George's case in the public eye and to push for answers. George's mother, Maureen Smith, has said she has no doubt in her mind that her son was murdered. She points to all the evidence, all the inconsistencies in the cruise line's account, all the suspicious behavior from the key witnesses. She refuses to accept the idea that what happened was simply a tragic accident. And when you look at the totality of the evidence, it's hard not to agree with her. Think about it. George was in his cabin with 4 men. There was arguing, there was a struggle, there was blood, and then George was gone. His body never recovered from the Mediterranean Sea. Those 4 men won't talk about what happened. They invoke the Fifth Amendment. They joke on video about his death. This doesn't sound like innocent bystanders to a tragedy. This sounds like people with something to hide. So what really happened that night? Based on the evidence available, we can piece together several possibilities. The drinking and gambling could have turned into an argument that escalated beyond anyone's control. Given the forensic evidence and witness accounts, this scenario suggests one or more of these men may have assaulted George. The missing Breitling watch, a wedding gift worth thousands of dollars, raises the possibility of robbery as a motive, though we can't know this with certainty. What we do know is that something violent occurred in that cabin. The question of how George ended up going over the balcony is perhaps the most troubling. The physical evidence provides some clues. The positioning of the balcony chair could imply someone needed elevation to move a body over the railing. The blood on George's bedsheets indicates he was injured inside the cabin, not on the balcony itself. The handprint on the ship's rail suggests desperate resistance, someone trying to hold on. When we look at these elements together, they paint a picture that appears more consistent with violence than with a simple accident. George Smith's case has become emblematic of the challenges of investigating crimes on cruise ships. The delayed response, the jurisdictional confusion, the contamination of evidence, the disappearance of witnesses, the lack of transparency from the cruise line. All of these factors combined to create a situation where a potential murder went unsolved, where the people who might be responsible have faced no consequences, where a family has been left without justice or closure. The case also led to congressional hearings and was instrumental in the passage of the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, which we'll talk about more later. But that legislative victory, as important as it was, doesn't bring George back. It doesn't give his family the answers they deserve. It doesn't punish whoever is responsible for his death. George Allen Smith, IV, should be alive today. He should have celebrated his 20th wedding anniversary. He should have raised children, grown old with his wife, enjoyed his life. Instead, he spent the last moments of his life in his cabin on what was supposed to be his honeymoon cruise, involved in some kind of violent confrontation that ended with him dead in the Mediterranean Sea. And the people who know what really happened, who were in that cabin, who heard the arguing and the struggle and the thud, those people have chosen silence. They've chosen to protect themselves rather than tell the truth about what happened to George Smith. It's a betrayal of justice. It's a failure of the system, and it's a tragedy that continues to haunt George's family more than 20 years after that terrible night. The case remains officially unsolved, though in the minds of those who have studied the evidence, there's little doubt that what happened to George Smith IV was murder. The only question is whether anyone will ever be held accountable for it. The mysterious disappearance of Rebecca Coriam. While the cases of Amy Lynn Bradley and George Smith IV involved passengers, our next case centers on a crew member, and it raises disturbing questions about how cruise lines handle the disappearances of their own employees. This is the story of Rebecca Coriam, a young woman whose vanishing from a Disney cruise ship sparked allegations of cover-up and corporate malfeasance that persist to this day. Rebecca Coriam was 24 years old, from Chester, England. She was, by all accounts, a delightful young woman. Outgoing, bubbly, great with children, described as having a happy-go-lucky personality with plenty to live for. She had studied childhood studies, psychology and philosophy at Liverpool Hope University, and her dream was to work for Disney. When she was offered a position as a youth worker on the Disney Wonder cruise ship in 2010, she was absolutely thrilled. This was the job she'd always wanted, and she was perfect for it. Rebecca, who went by the nickname Bex, joined the Disney Wonder in June 2010. The ship typically runs cruises along the Mexican Riviera, and Rebecca settled into life at sea. She made friends among the crew, she excelled at her job working with children, and she seemed genuinely happy. She stayed in regular contact with her family back in England, and all her communications suggested she was thriving in her new environment. But on March 22, 2011, everything changed. That day, the Disney Wonder was off the Pacific coast of Mexico, docked at Puerto Vallarta. At 5:45 in the morning, Rebecca was captured on the ship's security cameras in the crew lounge. She appeared to be on an internal phone call, and she seemed distressed. The video shows Rebecca talking, and even though there's no audio, it's clear from her body language and facial expressions that she's upset about something. She's agitated, perhaps even crying. Another crew member approaches her during the call and asks if she's okay. Rebecca appears to reply that she's fine, and the crew member walks away. Rebecca finishes her call, gathers herself, and walks out of the frame. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Coriam. A few hours later, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Rebecca failed to report for her shift. This was completely out of character for her. She was reliable, punctual, professional. When she didn't show up, her colleagues became concerned. They tried to find her. They called her name over the ship's announcement system. They searched her cabin, but Rebecca was nowhere to be found. The Disney Wonder conducted a ship-wide search. They looked everywhere. They checked every public area, every accessible space, every place Rebecca might have gone. They searched for hours, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The United States Coast Guard was notified, as was the Mexican Navy. They conducted searches of the surrounding waters, but Rebecca Coriam was never found. Not her body, not any of her belongings, nothing. 3 days after Rebecca's disappearance, Disney contacted the Royal Bahamas Police Force to conduct an investigation. You see, the Disney Wonder is registered in the Bahamas, which means that Bahamian authorities technically have jurisdiction over crimes that occur on the ship. The RBPF assigned a single detective, Superintendent Paul Roll, to the case. Disney flew him out to Los Angeles via private jet when the ship returned to port. According to the initial reports, Superintendent Rollet, spent several days on board the ship investigating. But when Rebecca's parents, Mike and Anne Coriam, flew from England to Los Angeles to meet the ship when it docked, the detective told them something very different. He said he had actually only spent 1 day investigating before flying back to the Bahamas. He had interviewed only a handful of crew members and none of the passengers. He had conducted what can only be described as a cursory investigation at best. The Coriams were brought on board the ship, but only after all the passengers had disembarked. They were driven to the ship in a car with blacked-out windows, entering through a back entrance. Everything about their treatment suggested that Disney wanted to minimize their visibility, to keep this situation as quiet as possible. On board, they met with the ship's captain and were shown the security footage of Rebecca's last known appearance. They were taken to Deck 5, an area near the crew swimming pool, where the captain explained his theory about what had happened to Rebecca. According to the captain, Rebecca had been swept overboard by a rogue wave while she was near the crew pool. This theory became Disney's official explanation for Rebecca's disappearance. The captain gave them a sandal that he said had been found on Deck 5 and claimed it belonged to Rebecca. And that was essentially it. The Coriams were given this explanation, this single piece of potential evidence, and they were expected to accept it and go home. But the Coriams didn't accept it, because the rogue wave theory didn't make sense. Deck 5, where the crew pool is located, is not a location where someone could easily be swept overboard. The deck is surrounded by walls that reach over 6 feet in height. For a wave to be powerful enough to lift a person over those walls and carry them off the ship, it would have to be enormous. And there were no reports of such rough seas that day. The weather conditions near Puerto Vallarta on March 22nd were normal. Calm waters, no storms, certainly nothing that would generate a rogue wave of the magnitude necessary to explain Rebecca's disappearance. Furthermore, if such a massive wave had hit the ship with enough force to sweep someone overboard, it would have caused visible damage to the vessel itself. There would have been reports from other crew members or passengers about experiencing rough seas. But there was nothing, no damage, no reports, no evidence of the kind of freak weather event that Disney was claiming had occurred. The Coriams began to suspect that there was more to their daughter's disappearance than they were being told. So they hired a private investigator, Roy Ram, a former specialist with Scotland Yard. They also sought help from their local Member of Parliament, Chris Matheson, and from former Deputy Prime Minister Lord Prescott. What these investigators uncovered raised even more questions about Disney's handling of the case. First, there was the security footage. The video that the Coriams had been shown, and that has since been made public, had been cropped. Specifically, the timestamp and location information had been removed. Why would Disney edit the footage in this way? What were they trying to hide? Investigators discovered that the video was actually from Deck 1, not Deck 5, where Disney claimed Rebecca had been swept overboard. This meant that Rebecca would have had to travel from Deck 1 to Deck 5 after her phone call, with no security camera capturing her journey. Investigators also found it suspicious that there appeared to be no security footage of Rebecca anywhere else on the ship that morning, despite the fact that Disney claimed to have extensive camera coverage. Then there was the matter of Rebecca's clothing. In the security video, Rebecca appears to be wearing oversized clothes that don't fit her properly. Some investigators have suggested these might not have been her clothes at all, but rather belonging to someone else. This detail could imply several things. Perhaps she had dressed hastily, or the clothing might indicate she'd been in circumstances where her own clothes were unavailable. Without more context, we can only note this as an unusual detail that adds to the overall questions surrounding her final hours. There were also questions about the phone call Rebecca was having in the video. Who was she talking to? What was the conversation about? Why was she so upset? Disney claimed they didn't know who was on the other end of the call and refused to provide any information about it. But one of Rebecca's friends among the crew later revealed that Rebecca had been in an intense relationship with another crew member, and the relationship had been volatile. Melissa, the friend, believed Rebecca might have been on the phone with this partner and that whatever was said during that call had caused her distress. This revelation opened up another possible explanation for Rebecca's disappearance. Had she been involved in a domestic dispute? Had her partner done something to her? Some investigators, including British MP Chris Matheson, have suggested that Rebecca may have been murdered, possibly by someone she knew. They point to the lack of evidence for the rogue wave theory, the unusual circumstances of her disappearance, and allegations that have surfaced over the years suggesting Rebecca may have been the victim of sexual assault or other violence. Adding to the family's frustration was Disney's response to their attempts to get answers. The Coriams have repeatedly said that Disney has stonewalled their investigation, has failed to provide promised information, has been more interested in avoiding bad publicity than in finding out what happened to Rebecca. Disney conducted a memorial service for Rebecca on Deck 5, while the ship was still in port in Los Angeles, laying flowers at the site of the alleged rogue wave accident, even though the investigation was supposedly still ongoing. It seemed like the company wanted to close the case as quickly as possible, to put it behind them and move on. In March 2014, the Coriams sued Disney for failing in their duty of care to keep their daughter safe. They claimed Disney had waited 4 hours to notify the Coast Guard and almost 7 hours to notify the Bahamian police, crucial delays that made the search for Rebecca much less effective. Disney denied these allegations and said the claims had no merit. The case was eventually settled out of court in 2016, with the terms of the settlement remaining confidential. But even with the lawsuit resolved, the Coriams have never stopped pushing for answers. British government officials have been highly critical of both Disney and the Bahamian authorities. In November 2011, Rebecca's MP, Stephen Mosley, brought the case up in the House of Commons, telling the Minister for Shipping that the investigation into Rebecca's disappearance was appalling. He stated that the Bahamian authorities made virtually no attempt to investigate and said the RBPF was internationally recognized as almost toothless. He pointed out that many passengers don't realize how poorly protected they are when they board cruise ships registered in flag of convenience countries. This criticism led to some legislative changes in the United Kingdom. The government announced that the Marine Accident Investigation Branch would investigate all deaths or disappearances of British citizens from vessels anywhere in the world. This mirrored similar legislation in the United States that gives the FBI jurisdiction in cases involving American citizens. But these legal changes, while important, don't bring Rebecca back. They don't answer what happened to her on that March morning in 2011. They don't address why Disney's explanation doesn't fit the evidence. They don't explain why a simple disappearance investigation seems to have so many holes in it, so many unanswered questions. Lord Prescott, the former Deputy Prime Minister, has stated publicly that he believes Rebecca was thrown over the side of the Disney Wonder. He thinks she was murdered. Chris Matheson, who has continued to investigate the case, has said that there's a real possibility Rebecca was murdered and that there is sufficient evidence to indicate a crime took place. These are serious allegations from serious people, not conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. So what really happened to Rebecca Coriam? The official explanation suggests she was swept overboard by a freak wave. Yet this theory raises several questions given the lack of supporting evidence. Looking at the circumstances, we can consider several possibilities. If the distressed phone call and concerns raised by her colleagues are indicators something may have been troubling her in the hours before she vanished. The injury to her nose and the distressed state captured on CCTV could suggest she had been in some kind of confrontation, though we can't know the specifics with certainty. Based on the forensic evidence and witness accounts, some investigators believe the possibility of foul play cannot be ruled out. Others wonder if overwhelming personal circumstances might have led to a tragic decision. The frustrating reality is that without a proper investigation from the start, these questions may never have definitive answers. The truth is, we may never know. The investigation was bungled from the beginning. Evidence was lost. The scene was not properly preserved. Crucial interviews were not conducted. And Disney, whether through incompetence or deliberate obfuscation, has failed to provide the kind of transparency and cooperation that might have led to answers. What we do know is that Rebecca Coriam was 24 years old when she vanished. She had her whole life ahead of her. She had a job she loved, a family that adored her, friends who cared about her, and in the space of a few hours, she went from being a happy, productive member of society to being gone without a trace. Her family has been left with nothing but questions and suspicions, grieving for a daughter they may never be able to properly lay to rest. Rebecca's case has become a rallying point for critics of the cruise industry's handling of crew member welfare. It's been pointed out that crew members, who often come from developing countries and work long hours for relatively little pay, are particularly vulnerable. They're far from home, working in an isolated environment with limited legal protections. If something happens to them, who will advocate for them? Who will demand answers? In Rebecca's case, it took her family flying halfway around the world and hiring private investigators just to get basic information about what might have happened. The case also highlights the problems with flag of convenience ship registration. The Disney Wonder flies a Bahamian flag, which means Bahamian law applies and Bahamian authorities have jurisdiction. But the Bahamas, like many countries that offer flag of convenience registrations, doesn't have the resources or perhaps the motivation to conduct thorough investigations into incidents on these ships. The result is that crimes can occur in what amounts to a legal dead zone, where no one has a clear responsibility to investigate and no one can be held truly accountable. Rebecca Coriam deserved better. She deserved a thorough investigation. She deserved transparency from her employer. She deserved to have her case taken seriously. But instead, her disappearance was quickly written off as an accident, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Her family was given the runaround. And years later, we're no closer to knowing the truth about what happened to her than we were the day she vanished. The disappearance of Merrian Carver and her father's crusade. Our next case is particularly heartbreaking, not just because of the mysterious disappearance at its center, but because of the cruise line's stunning failure to report it in a timely manner, and because of one father's determination to turn his tragedy into meaningful change for others. This is the story of Amy Lynn Carver and her father, Kendall Carver. Merrian Carver was 40 years old in the summer of 2004. She was a fascinating woman, with a complex life. She had worked as an investment banker, a high-powered career that had afforded her financial security. But she was also a poet, a creative soul with a contemplative nature. She was described as vivacious and independent, someone who marched to the beat of her own drum. She had one child, and she lived off a trust fund and her investments, having left the banking world behind. Merrian was also going through a difficult period in her life. She had gone through a divorce several years earlier, and while she seemed to have recovered well, those who knew her were aware that she sometimes struggled with her mental health. There had been an incident years before when she had threatened to harm herself, though in recent years she seemed stable and was managing well. In August 2004, Merrian decided she needed a break. She needed to clear her head, to get away from everything for a little while. So, without telling anyone in her family, she booked herself on a cruise. This wasn't entirely out of character for her. Merrian had been known to take spontaneous trips before, when she needed time alone to think. So when she boarded the Celebrity Mercury in Seattle, Washington, on August 27, 2004, bound for a 7-day Alaskan cruise, her family had no idea she had even left home. The cruise was supposed to make stops in Juneau, Skagway, and Ketchikan in Alaska, as well as in Prince Rupert, British Columbia. It would end on September 3rd, when the ship docked in Vancouver, British Columbia. Merrian was supposed to fly home from there, but she never boarded that flight, and she was never seen again. Merrian's cabin steward, a man named Domingo Montero, would later testify about his interactions with her during the cruise. He said she was personable and relaxed, looking forward to the trip. On her first night aboard, August 27th, she told him she planned to go upstairs later but didn't want to visit the dining room. Montero didn't think much of it. Many passengers prefer casual dining or room service to the formal dining room. The next night, August 28th, when Merrian again said she didn't want to go to the dining room, Montero suggested ordering room service. He brought her 2 sandwiches at her request. And that was the last time anyone from the ship's crew or any passenger reported seeing Merrian Carver. From August 28th onward, she was simply gone. Her cabin was empty. Her belongings were still there, but Merrian herself had vanished. Here's where the story takes a turn into the truly outrageous. Domingo Montero, Merrian's steward, noticed that she was missing. He went to his supervisor and reported that his passenger hadn't been seen and wasn't using her cabin. And his supervisor told him to do nothing. Just do your job and forget about it. So Montero, a low-level employee who probably feared losing his job if he made waves, did as he was told. He didn't report Merrian missing. He just went about his duties. Day after day passed. Merrian's cabin remained empty. Her belongings sat untouched. And Montero kept going to his supervisor saying, "This woman is still missing. Shouldn't we do something?" And his supervisor kept telling him, "No, don't make a fuss. Just do your job." The cruise ended on September 3rd. Passengers disembarked in Vancouver, and cruise line officials, faced with a cabin full of belongings from a passenger who hadn't been seen in days, didn't notify authorities. They didn't call the police. They didn't report Merrian missing to anyone. Instead, they boxed up her belongings. And then they donated most of them to charity. Let that sink in for a moment. A passenger goes missing from a cruise ship. Her disappearance is reported multiple times by her cabin steward. And the cruise line's response is to pack up her stuff, give it away, and move on as if nothing happened. They didn't investigate. They didn't notify her family. They didn't tell anyone. It wasn't until September the 7th, more than a week after the cruise ended, that Merrian's family realized something was wrong and reported her missing. They hadn't even known she'd gone on a cruise. When a detective began investigating her disappearance, he accessed her credit card records and discovered she had made a purchase in Seattle, the embarkation point for the Celebrity Mercury. The detective called the cruise line to ask if Merrian had been on the ship. It took Celebrity Cruises, which is owned by Royal Caribbean, 3 days to confirm that yes, Merrian Carver had indeed been on that cruise. By this point, it had been 26 days since she was last seen. 26 days. In those 26 days, the ship had completed multiple cruises. Evidence had been cleaned away. Witnesses had scattered. Any chance of conducting a meaningful investigation into what happened to Merrian had been destroyed. When Merrian's father, Kendall Carver, learned that the cruise line had known his daughter was missing but hadn't reported it, he was devastated and furious. He called Royal Caribbean, demanding answers. The risk management manager he spoke with told him that it was normal for passengers to leave their belongings behind. It was normal for them to suddenly change rooms without notice. In other words, the cruise line was claiming there was no reason to think anything was amiss. Kendall Carver didn't buy it. A passenger doesn't just abandon all their belongings and disappear. A steward doesn't repeatedly tell his supervisor someone is missing unless something is actually wrong. And a responsible cruise line doesn't just box up a missing person's belongings and donate them to Goodwill. Kendall knew something terrible had happened to his daughter, and he was determined to find out what. He hired a private investigator named Tim Schmolder to get answers. Schmolder tried his best, but he was stonewalled at every turn. Royal Caribbean provided some basic information, but set up numerous roadblocks. Schmolder's requests to interview passengers or crew members were denied. He wasn't allowed access to the ship's video surveillance system. He was given only limited time on board the ship. After just a few hours, he was told to leave. His investigation report ended up, in his own words, kind of empty of content but full of questions. Questions about why he wasn't allowed access, why the cabin attendant wasn't available for interview, why he couldn't speak to the security manager about the camera systems. Kendall Carver wasn't satisfied with that, so he took legal action. He filed a lawsuit against Royal Caribbean, and as part of that lawsuit, he was able to obtain subpoenas for information. The subpoenas produced a passenger manifest with 2,000 names, but no contact information, making it useless for conducting interviews. They also produced a poor-quality photograph of Merrian boarding the ship, but little else. The real bombshell came when Carver's attorneys forced Royal Caribbean to make Domingo Montero, Merrian's cabin steward, available for deposition. That's when the full extent of the cruise line's negligence came to light. Montero testified that he had reported Merrian missing to his supervisor daily for 5 consecutive days. Every day he told his boss that this passenger was missing, that her cabin was unused, that something was wrong. And every day his supervisor told him to forget about it. At the end of the cruise, when Merrian's belongings were still sitting in her cabin, Montero asked his supervisor if they should report this to authorities. The supervisor said no. He told Montero to pack up all the belongings, put them in his locker, and he would take care of it. But he didn't take care of it. Or rather, he took care of it in the worst possible way. He had those belongings donated or disposed of, destroying potential evidence. And then, once the Carvers started asking questions and making noise, Royal Caribbean held an internal hearing and fired that supervisor. He was quietly ushered off the ship before the FBI could interview him. He has never been named publicly and has never been located, though many believe he simply found work on another cruise ship. During the litigation process, Kendall Carver also learned that a manila envelope containing money that Merrian had left in her room had disappeared along with other personal belongings. He discovered that Royal Caribbean had lied about their video retention policy. They had told him that surveillance footage was only kept for 2 or 3 weeks, and that therefore there was no video of Merrian. But documents produced during discovery showed that the cruise line had actually reviewed videos concerning Merrian on the 26th day after her disappearance, and that videos were kept on a 30-day cycle. This meant there should have been footage of Merrian, but Royal Caribbean claimed it didn't exist. In 2005, Royal Caribbean issued a press release stating that Merrian appears to have committed suicide on our ship. This infuriated the Carver family. How could the cruise line make such a definitive statement about what happened when they had conducted no real investigation? Kendall Carver has acknowledged that suicide is a possibility. Merrian had struggled with mental health issues in the past, but without a proper investigation, without a body, without any real evidence, claiming she died by suicide felt like the cruise line was just trying to close the case and avoid liability. The truth is, we don't know what happened to Merrian Carver. Based on the limited evidence available, several scenarios remain possible. She could have fallen overboard accidentally, perhaps while on deck late at night. Given her past mental health struggles, as her father has acknowledged, the possibility of suicide cannot be entirely dismissed, though there's no conclusive evidence to support this. The lack of any witnesses or physical evidence also means we can't rule out the possibility of foul play, or perhaps a medical emergency in an area of the ship where she wasn't immediately discovered. Without the proper investigation that should have been conducted in those critical first hours and days, these questions will likely remain unanswered. But what Kendall Carver did know was that his daughter's case represented a massive failure by the cruise industry, and he was determined that what happened to Merrian would not happen to others. So in 2006, Kendall Carver did something extraordinary. He founded the International Cruise Victims Association, a non-profit organization dedicated to advocating for victims of crimes on cruise ships and their families. The ICFIE, as it's known, brought together families who had lost loved ones on cruises under suspicious or unexplained circumstances. Together, they became a powerful lobbying force. They testified before Congress. They worked with lawmakers to draft legislation. They raised public awareness about the dark side of the cruise industry. And they pushed for reforms that would make cruising safer and would ensure that when crimes did occur, they would be properly investigated and reported. Kendall Carver personally testified before Congress multiple times. He shared Merrian's story. He detailed the cruise line's failures. He explained how the lack of regulation and oversight allowed cruise companies to essentially police themselves with predictable results. He pointed out how the jurisdictional complexities of maritime law created an environment where crimes could occur without anyone being held accountable. His efforts, along with those of other ICV members, including the Smith family, were instrumental in the passage of the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, a landmark piece of legislation that mandated numerous safety and reporting requirements for cruise ships. We'll discuss the CVSSA in more detail later, but for now, it's important to understand that this law exists in large part because of Kendall Carver's determination to find meaning in his daughter's disappearance. Kendall Carver continued his advocacy work for more than a decade. He spent over $75,000 of his own money on private investigators and legal fees trying to find out what happened to Merrian. He dedicated countless hours to the ICV, helping other families navigate the nightmare of having a loved one disappear on a cruise. He became a nationally recognized expert on cruise ship safety and crime, and he never stopped fighting, never stopped pushing for change. Sadly, Kendall Carver passed away in 2019 at the age of 83. He died without ever knowing what happened to his daughter. But his legacy lives on in the ICV, which continues its advocacy work, and in the legislation he helped pass, which has made cruising safer for millions of people. Merrian Carver's disappearance is a tragedy. The cruise line's handling of it is a scandal. But the response to it, led by her father, is a testament to the power of determined advocacy. Kendall Carver took his grief and his anger and he channeled it into something positive. He turned his personal tragedy into a force for change, and while nothing can bring Merrian back, the work her father did has undoubtedly saved lives and has helped other families avoid some of the obstacles he faced. If Celebrity Cruises had reported Merrian missing when her steward first raised concerns, if they had conducted a proper search of the ship and contacted authorities immediately, if they had preserved evidence and interviewed witnesses while memories were fresh, we might know what happened to her. There might have been a chance to save her if she was still alive somewhere on the ship. There might have been enough evidence to determine what happened even if she had died. But instead, the cruise line chose to prioritize its operations over a missing passenger. Their response raised serious questions about their investigative protocols and priorities. And as a result, Merrian Carver remains one of the many unsolved mysteries of the high seas. Maritime law, jurisdiction, and the perfect crime. At this point in our story, you might be asking yourself a question, a very reasonable question. How is it possible that so many serious crimes on cruise ships go unsolved? How can people disappear, be assaulted, even be murdered on these ships, and yet the perpetrators face no consequences? Why do investigations fail so spectacularly? Why does it feel like cruise lines can get away with negligence and even cover-ups without facing serious repercussions? The answer lies in the unique and complicated world of maritime law and international jurisdiction. You see, when you board a cruise ship, you're not just stepping onto a vacation vessel. You're entering a legal gray area, a floating territory governed by a complex web of laws from multiple nations, none of which seem to apply with the clarity and force we expect from our normal legal system. To understand why crimes on cruise ships are so difficult to investigate and prosecute, we need to understand how jurisdiction works on the high seas. Let's start with the basics. When a cruise ship is docked at a United States port, it's subject to United States law. The FBI, local police, and other American law enforcement agencies have clear jurisdiction. If a crime occurs while the ship is docked in Miami, for example, it's handled just like any other crime that occurs in Miami. But once that ship leaves port and sails out into international waters, everything changes. International waters begin 12 nautical miles from the coastline of any nation. That's about 14 land miles. Once a ship crosses that invisible line, it's no longer in United States waters, and United States domestic law no longer clearly applies. Instead, the ship falls under the jurisdiction of whatever country it's registered in, what's called its flag state. This is where things get complicated and frankly convenient for the cruise industry. Most large cruise ships are not registered in the United States. Instead, they're registered in what are called flag of convenience nations. These are countries that offer ship registration with minimal regulations, low taxes, and lax labor laws. The most popular flag of convenience nations for cruise ships are the Bahamas, Panama, Liberia, and Malta. About 70% of cruise ships worldwide are registered in these nations. Why do cruise lines choose these registrations? It's simple economics. By registering their ships in the Bahamas instead of the United States, cruise lines avoid stricter American regulations regarding safety, labor practices, and environmental standards. They pay lower taxes. They can hire crew members from developing nations and pay them much less than they would have to pay American workers. It's a business decision based purely on maximizing profits. But this flag of convenience system has serious implications when crimes occur. Because technically, when a crime happens on a cruise ship in international waters, the flag state has primary jurisdiction. So if someone is assaulted on a Bahamas-registered ship while it's cruising through the Caribbean, Bahamian law applies, and Bahamian authorities have the responsibility to investigate. Now, as we've seen in cases like Rebecca Coriam's, these flag of convenience nations often lack the resources, the expertise, or the will to conduct thorough investigations. The Royal Bahamas Police Force sent one detective to investigate Rebecca's disappearance, and he spent one day on the ship. That's not because the Bahamian authorities don't care. It's because they're a small nation with limited resources, and they're expected to investigate crimes on dozens of cruise ships, each carrying thousands of people, sailing all over the world. It's an impossible task. The situation gets even more complicated when you consider that crimes on cruise ships often involve people from multiple countries. The victim might be American, the perpetrator might be from Russia, or Brazil or India, the ship might be registered in the Bahamas, and the crime might occur in international waters between Greece and Turkey. So whose laws apply? Who has jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute? These questions don't have simple answers. In recognition of these challenges, the United States has asserted some level of jurisdiction over crimes involving American citizens on cruise ships, even when those ships are registered in other countries. The FBI can investigate if the victim or perpetrator is a United States national, if the ship departed from or is arriving at a United States port, or if the ship is owned wholly or partially by a United States person or corporation. This is why we see FBI involvement in many cruise ship cases. But even with the FBI's involvement, investigations face enormous challenges. By the time the FBI is notified of a crime, the ship is often still at sea or has already docked at a foreign port. The ship is a mobile crime scene, constantly on the move. Passengers and crew disembark. New passengers and crew come aboard. The scene gets contaminated. Evidence is cleaned away. Witnesses scatter to the four winds, returning to their homes in dozens of different countries. And cruise lines, while they're required to report certain crimes, are not always as cooperative as they should be. Their first concern is often protecting their brand and their bottom line. A major criminal investigation is bad publicity. It disrupts their operations. It might lead to negative media coverage that scares off future passengers. So there's an incentive, whether explicit or implicit, to downplay incidents, to quickly clean up and move on, to present any crime as an isolated incident that has been resolved. This is not to say that all cruise lines deliberately obstruct justice. Many do cooperate with law enforcement, but the structure of the industry and the legal framework governing it create a situation where even well-meaning cruise lines can fail to adequately preserve evidence or facilitate investigations, and cruise lines that are less scrupulous can take advantage of the legal ambiguities to avoid accountability. Consider what happens when a disappearance occurs. Let's say a passenger goes missing in the middle of the night. By the time they're reported missing and a search begins, hours have passed. The ship has traveled dozens of miles. If the person went overboard, their body could be anywhere in a vast search area. The longer the delay, the less likely a successful search becomes. And if the person disappeared due to foul play, the delay gives the perpetrator time to clean up, to dispose of evidence, to get their story straight. Now factor in the jurisdictional issues. Who leads the investigation? The ship's security, which is employed by the cruise line, the FBI, if they can establish jurisdiction, the police from the flag state, the authorities from whatever port the ship next docks at. In practice, there's often confusion and lack of coordination. Different agencies with different priorities and different levels of expertise try to work together, often unsuccessfully. And then there's the question of where a prosecution would take place, assuming investigators even identify a perpetrator. If an American is murdered by a Russian on a Bahamas-registered ship in international waters, which country prosecutes? The United States could assert jurisdiction based on the victim's nationality. Russia could claim jurisdiction based on the perpetrator's nationality. The Bahamas has jurisdiction as the flag state. In practice, these jurisdictional conflicts often result in no prosecution at all. No country wants to take on the expense and complexity of prosecuting a case that occurred outside their territory and involves foreign nationals. This jurisdictional chaos creates what some have called a perfect crime scenario. A perpetrator who commits a crime on a cruise ship in international waters, especially if they're crew member from a developing nation, faces very little risk of being caught or punished. The investigation will be delayed and hampered by jurisdictional issues. Evidence will be lost. Witnesses will disappear. And even if they're identified as a suspect, it's unclear which country would have the authority or the will to prosecute them. For victims, this system is a nightmare. If you're assaulted on a cruise ship, you can't just call 911 and have local police respond. You have to report it to the ship's security, which is employed by the cruise line and may not have your best interests at heart. The security personnel are not trained law enforcement officers. They're private security guards with limited training and limited authority. Their priority is managing the situation in a way that minimizes disruption to the ship's operations and protects the cruise line's interests. If the ship is in international waters, the security team will document the incident and report it to their shoreside management, who will then determine whether it needs to be reported to law enforcement. But which law enforcement? The FBI? The flag state? The police in whatever port they're heading to? The answer depends on the nature of the crime, the nationalities of those involved, and the location of the ship. And even once law enforcement is notified, they may not be able to respond immediately. They might not be able to board the ship until it returns to port, which could be days away. Meanwhile, the victim is stuck on the ship, possibly in close proximity to their attacker. If the perpetrator is another passenger, the cruise line might separate them. But there's no brig on most cruise ships. No way to truly detain someone. If the perpetrator is a crew member, the cruise line might confine them to quarters, but enforcement is difficult. And in some cases, shockingly, victims have reported that cruise line security personnel discourage them from reporting crimes, suggesting they would face retaliation or that nothing could be done anyway. This is the dark reality of maritime law and cruise ship jurisdiction. It's a system that benefits cruise lines by allowing them to operate with minimal regulation while shifting the burden of law enforcement onto countries that may lack the resources or incentive to effectively police these floating cities. It's a system that makes it very difficult for victims to get justice and very easy for perpetrators to escape consequences. The good news is that there has been some progress in recent years. The Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010 was a significant step forward. It mandated specific security measures, improved reporting requirements, and provided some framework for coordination between cruise lines and law enforcement. But it's not perfect, and it only applies to ships calling on United States ports. For cruise itineraries that don't touch United States territory, passengers have even fewer protections. And even with the CVSSA in place, the fundamental jurisdictional challenges remain. The Act improves reporting and mandates some safety measures, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem of how to effectively police and prosecute crimes that occur in the unique environment of international waters on ships registered in foreign countries. The reality is that when you board a cruise ship, you're entering a world where your usual legal protections are diminished. You're traveling through international waters where no single nation's laws fully apply. You're on a ship registered in a country whose legal system you may not be familiar with and which may not prioritize your safety. You're surrounded by crew members from dozens of different countries, any one of whom could potentially harm you, and the mechanisms for holding them accountable are weak at best. This doesn't mean you should never take a cruise. Millions of people cruise safely every year. But it does mean you should be aware of the risks and take precautions. Don't let your guard down just because you're on vacation. Don't assume that the cruise line has your best interests at heart. And understand that if something does go wrong, getting justice may be a long, frustrating, and ultimately unsuccessful process. The cases we've discussed today, Amy Lynn Bradley, George Smith IV, Rebecca Coriam, Merrian Carver, and many others, all illustrate the challenges of the current system. In each case, the investigation was delayed, hampered, or bungled due to jurisdictional issues and lack of coordination. In each case, evidence was lost or contaminated. In each case, families were left without answers and without justice. And in each case, the cruise line seemed more concerned with protecting its image than with finding out what really happened. These are not isolated incidents. They're the predictable result of a system that prioritizes corporate profits over passenger safety, that allows cruise lines to operate in a legal gray area with minimal oversight, and that makes it nearly impossible to effectively investigate and prosecute crimes on the high seas. Until this system is fundamentally reformed, until there's clear jurisdiction and accountability, cruise ships will continue to be environments where crimes can occur with disturbing frequency and where perpetrators can act with impunity. The modern reality, statistics, and trends. Now that we understand the legal landscape and the challenges of investigating crimes on cruise ships, let's look at the current state of affairs. Just how common are crimes on cruise ships? What kinds of crimes are we talking about? And are things getting better or worse? The numbers are sobering. According to the most recent data available from the Department of Transportation, which compiles statistics based on cruise line reporting as mandated by the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, crimes on cruise ships are not only common, but they appear to be increasing. In 2023, cruise lines reported a total of 131 alleged sexual assaults and rapes to the FBI. To break that down further, there were 52 sexual assaults and 79 rapes reported. This represented a significant increase from the previous year. In 2022, there were 89 reported sex crimes total, with no distinction made between sexual assault and rape. The 2023 numbers show a nearly 50% increase in reported sexual violence. Let's put that in context. 131 reported sexual assaults and rapes in a single year. That's more than one every 3 days. And remember, these are only the reported incidents, only the crimes that met the specific reporting thresholds under the CVSSA, and only the ones that victims felt comfortable reporting. The actual number of sexual assaults on cruise ships is almost certainly much higher. Research by organizations like the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, known as RAINN, has consistently shown that 2 out of every 3 sexual assaults are never reported to authorities. Victims may be ashamed, afraid, unsure of what happened, or simply want to forget and move on. This underreporting is even more pronounced in the cruise ship environment, where victims are isolated, far from home, surrounded by strangers, and may face pressure from cruise line personnel to keep quiet. If we apply this 2/3 underreporting rate to the cruise ship numbers, it suggests that the actual number of sexual assaults and rapes on cruise ships in 2023 could have been closer to 400. 400 sexual assaults and rapes in a single year on cruise ships. That's a deeply disturbing number. Sexual violence is by far the most common crime reported on cruise ships. According to FBI agents who specialize in cruise ship cases, sexual assaults top the list of incidents they investigate, followed by physical assaults. In 2023, in addition to the 131 sex crimes, there were 22 reports of physical assault with serious bodily injury. There were also 7 reported thefts of money or property worth more than $10,000, 2 missing United States nationals, and 1 suspicious death. Let's talk about those missing persons numbers for a moment. 2 reported missing American nationals in 2023 might sound like a small number. But remember, this is only for that 1 year, and it only counts American citizens. When you look at the broader data, over the past 2 decades, approximately 400 people have gone missing from cruise ships worldwide. 400 people who boarded cruise ships and never came home. Some of these were likely accidents, people who fell overboard due to intoxication or recklessness. Some were probably suicides, but many remain complete mysteries, with no explanation for how or why they vanished. And these numbers, remember, only capture crimes that are officially reported under the CVSSA. There are countless other crimes that don't meet the reporting thresholds. Minor thefts, simple assaults that don't cause serious injury, drug offenses, domestic violence between passengers. All of these occur on cruise ships with some regularity, but they're not captured in the official statistics that the public sees. One particularly concerning trend is that certain cruise lines have significantly higher crime rates than others. Carnival Cruise Line, one of the largest cruise operators in the world, consistently reports more crimes than its competitors. In 2023, Carnival reported 45 sexual assaults and rapes, compared to significantly lower numbers for other major cruise lines like Royal Caribbean and Norwegian. Carnival also led in physical assaults, with 14 incidents of assault causing serious bodily injury reported in 2023. Carnival has attempted to explain these numbers by pointing out that they have more ships and carry more passengers than many competitors. But maritime lawyers who have analyzed the data dispute this explanation. When you calculate crimes on a per capita basis, accounting for the number of passengers and crew on ships at any given time, Carnival's ships still have a higher rate of violence than their competitors. Some analysts have calculated that Carnival's per capita rate of sexual assault is higher than the rate in many United States states. Why might Carnival have a higher rate of crime? There are several theories. One is the company's culture around alcohol. Multiple experts have noted that Carnival ships tend to have a party atmosphere, with heavy emphasis on drinking. Alcohol is aggressively marketed to passengers, and bartenders and servers work on commission, giving them an incentive to serve as many drinks as possible. We know that alcohol is a major factor in both sexual assault and physical violence. The more people drink, especially in an environment where social norms are relaxed and people feel like they can let loose, the more likely violent incidents become. Another factor may be Carnival's customer base. Carnival markets itself as a fun, affordable option, attracting younger passengers and those looking for a party atmosphere. This demographic may engage in riskier behavior and be more likely to both commit and be victims of crimes. Royal Caribbean and Norwegian, by contrast, tend to attract a somewhat older, more affluent demographic, which correlates with lower crime rates. It's also worth noting that Disney Cruise Line, which markets itself as family-friendly and caters to families with children, has seen a disturbing increase in sexual assault reports in recent years. In the 5 years between 2019 and 2024, Disney went from reporting between 1 and 3 sexual assaults per year to reporting 15 in 2023 and 18 in 2024. This dramatic increase is concerning and suggests that even on cruise lines that pride themselves on safety and family friendliness, sexual violence is a growing problem. What about the first half of 2024? The data we have shows that crimes continue at a troubling rate. From January to June 2024, there were 25 reports of sexual assault, 32 reports of rape, 16 reports of physical assault with serious bodily injury, 1 suspicious death, 7 thefts, and 2 missing United States nationals. If this rate continues for the full year, 2024 will see similar or even higher numbers than 2023. One area where there has been some improvement is in the first quarter of 2025. From January to March 2025, there were 48 crimes reported, down from previous quarters. But this is still 48 serious crimes in just 3 months, and the composition of these crimes is disturbing. Of the 48 incidents, 23 were reported as rapes, 10 as sexual assaults, and 7 as physical assaults. So sexual violence still dominates the statistics. These numbers represent real people, real victims. Behind each statistic is a person whose vacation turned into a nightmare. A woman who was raped by a crew member who entered her cabin. A man who was assaulted after an argument in a bar. A teenager who was sexually assaulted by another passenger. A person who vanished without a trace, leaving their family to wonder forever what happened. And these numbers, troubling as they are, still likely understate the true extent of crime on cruise ships. Because as we've discussed, many crimes go unreported. Victims may not feel safe reporting to cruise line security. They may not know they have the right to contact the FBI directly. They may simply want to finish their cruise and go home and try to forget what happened. And even when crimes are reported, cruise lines may find ways to avoid counting them in the official statistics. For example, the CVSSA only requires reporting of crimes that involve United States nationals or that occur on ships departing from or arriving at United States ports. Crimes involving passengers of other nationalities or crimes that occur on cruises that never touch United States territory don't have to be reported in these statistics. This means the data we see is inherently incomplete, capturing only a subset of the crimes that occur fleet-wide across the global cruise industry. There are also questions about whether cruise lines fully comply with reporting requirements. Critics have suggested that cruise lines may classify crimes in ways that avoid triggering mandatory reporting. For instance, a sexual assault might be recorded internally as a different type of incident, or might not be recorded at all if the victim is persuaded not to make a formal report. Without independent oversight, there's no way to verify that every reportable crime is actually being reported. The FBI has jurisdiction to investigate crimes on cruise ships, but they're limited by resources. The FBI doesn't have agents stationed on cruise ships. They have to respond from shore, often after significant delays. And while the FBI takes cruise ship crimes seriously, they're also dealing with countless other serious crimes on land. Cruise ship cases require extensive resources, often involving international cooperation, interviews with witnesses scattered across multiple countries, and complex legal questions about jurisdiction. The reality is that many cruise ship crimes simply don't get the level of investigative attention they would receive if they occurred on United States soil. So what's the cruise industry's response to these statistics? The Cruise Lines International Association, or CLIA, which is the industry's main trade group, has consistently maintained that cruising is one of the safest forms of travel. They point out that when you consider the millions of passengers who cruise each year, the rate of serious crime is actually quite low. They're not wrong about that. Approximately 31.7 million people took cruises in 2023. If there were 131 reported sexual assaults, that's a rate of about 4 per 100,000 passengers. For comparison, the rate of reported rape in the United States as a whole is higher than that. But this argument, while statistically accurate, misses some important points. First, as we've discussed, the reported numbers almost certainly understate the true rate of crime on cruise ships. Second, even if the rate is lower than on land, the conditions on cruise ships make crimes particularly traumatic and particularly difficult to escape. If you're assaulted in your hometown, you can call the police, go to a hospital, be surrounded by your support network. If you're assaulted on a cruise ship, you're trapped on the ship with your attacker, far from home, far from help, dependent on the cruise line to manage the situation. The isolation and vulnerability of cruise ship victims makes these crimes especially heinous. The cruise industry has made some improvements in response to the CVSSA and public pressure. Most cruise lines now have better security protocols. They've improved lighting in isolated areas. They've implemented better surveillance systems. They've trained crew members on how to respond to reports of sexual assault. They've provided victims with access to resources like the National Sexual Assault Hotline. These are positive steps. But many advocates for cruise ship victims argue that the industry could and should do more. They point to the continued high rates of sexual violence, the ongoing problems with underreporting, and the cruise line's tendency to minimize and downplay crimes as evidence that the current measures are insufficient. They call for independent oversight of cruise ship security, stronger penalties for cruise lines that fail to properly report or investigate crimes, and better protections for crew members who report misconduct. The bottom line is this: Cruise ships are not the safe havens that the glossy brochures suggest. Crimes happen on these ships with disturbing regularity. Sexual violence is a particular problem, affecting hundreds of passengers every year. People go missing under suspicious circumstances. Assaults occur. And the unique environment of cruise ships, the legal gray areas, the jurisdictional complications, the power dynamics between passengers and crew. All of these factors make crimes on cruise ships particularly difficult to prevent, investigate, and prosecute. If you're considering taking a cruise, you need to go into it with your eyes open. Be aware of the risks. Take precautions. Don't let your guard down just because you're on vacation. Watch your alcohol intake. Don't leave your drink unattended. Don't go off alone with people you don't know well. Lock your cabin door at night. Be aware of your surroundings. And if something does happen, report it immediately, not just to ship security, but directly to the FBI if it's a serious crime. The victims we've discussed in this video, Amy, George, Rebecca, Merrian, and the countless others whose stories we haven't had time to tell, deserve better. They deserve to be safe. They deserved to have their cases properly investigated. They deserved justice. And the best way to honor them is to demand that the cruise industry do better, that lawmakers strengthen protections for passengers, and that the traveling public understand the real risks they face when they board these floating cities. Conclusion and call to action. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored some of the most haunting mysteries and tragic crimes to unfold on cruise ships. We've met families who have been left without answers, who have dedicated years of their lives to fighting for truth and justice. We've examined the legal complexities that make cruise ships such challenging environments for law enforcement. And we've confronted the uncomfortable reality that despite the cruise industry's carefully crafted image of safety and luxury, these floating vacation paradises can become scenes of terrible crimes. Amy Lynn Bradley vanished in 1998 and has never been found, despite tantalizing reports that she might have been trafficked. George Smith IV died in suspicious circumstances on his honeymoon, with evidence suggesting murder and with key witnesses refusing to cooperate. Rebecca Coriam disappeared from a Disney ship, with her family convinced there was a cover-up. Merrian Carver vanished after the cruise line ignored multiple reports that she was missing. These cases represent just the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of people have gone missing from cruise ships. Hundreds more have been sexually assaulted. Physical violence occurs with disturbing regularity, and time after time, investigations fail. Evidence is lost. Witnesses scatter. Perpetrators escape justice. Families are left to grieve without closure, without understanding, without anyone being held accountable. Why does this keep happening? We've explored the reasons, the jurisdictional complexities of maritime law, the flag of convenience system that allows cruise ships to avoid stringent oversight, the power of the cruise industry to protect its image and profits, the challenges of investigating crimes that occur in international waters on mobile vessels, the lack of resources and coordination among the various law enforcement agencies involved. All of these factors combine to create an environment where crimes can occur and go unsolved. But it doesn't have to be this way. There have been improvements. The Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act was a significant step forward, mandating better reporting, improved security measures, and some accountability. The advocacy work of organizations like the International Cruise Victims Association has brought attention to these issues and has pushed for reforms. British lawmakers have strengthened protections for their citizens on cruise ships. The FBI has developed more expertise in handling cruise ship cases, yet clearly more needs to be done. Sexual assaults on cruise ships are increasing, not decreasing. People still go missing. Investigations still fail far too often. The fundamental problems with jurisdiction and accountability remain. As long as cruise ships operate in the legal gray area they currently occupy, as long as they're registered in countries that lack the resources or will to properly oversee them, as long as profits are prioritized over passenger safety, these problems will continue. So what can we do? As individuals, we can make informed choices. If you're considering a cruise, research the cruise line's safety record. Look up their crime statistics. Choose cruise lines that have demonstrated a commitment to passenger safety. Take precautions while on board. Be aware of your surroundings. Travel with people you trust. Report any incidents immediately. As citizens, we can demand better from our lawmakers. We can push for stronger legislation that protects passengers and crew on cruise ships. We can support organizations like the ICV that advocate for victims. We can speak out when we see cruise lines trying to minimize or cover up crimes. We can refuse to let cases like Amy's and George's and Rebecca's and Merrian's be forgotten. And we can share their stories. That's why content like this matters. Every time someone watches a video or reads an article about cruise ship crimes, awareness grows. Public pressure increases. The cruise industry can't as easily sweep these incidents under the rug. Families fighting for justice know they're not alone, and potential victims are better informed about the risks they face. The ocean is vast and beautiful and mysterious, and cruise ships offer an incredible opportunity to explore it in comfort. For millions of people every year, cruising is a wonderful experience that creates lasting memories. But we must never forget that beneath the surface glamour, there are real dangers, real crimes, real victims, and real families who are still waiting for answers. Amy Lynn Bradley should be home with her family. George Smith IV should have celebrated his 20th wedding anniversary. Rebecca Coriam should still be working her dream job. Merrian Carver should have finished her Alaska cruise and returned to her life. They didn't get those chances. But by telling their stories, by demanding accountability, by pushing for change, we can work towards a future where fewer families have to experience the nightmare of losing someone on a cruise ship. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark side of the cruise industry. It's been a long and sometimes difficult exploration, but it's an important one. If you found this video informative, please give it a like. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into true crime cases and mysteries. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future content. And please share this video with others. The more people who understand these issues, the better chance we have of creating real change. If you have thoughts about these cases, if you've had experiences on cruise ships, positive or negative, feel free to leave them in the comments. I read them all, and I'd love to hear your perspectives. And if you want to learn more about cruise ship safety and advocacy, check out the International Cruise Victims Association. They continue the work that Kendall Carver started, fighting for justice and safety for all cruise passengers and crew. Until next time, stay safe out there, both on land and at sea. And remember, when something seems too good to be true, when the glossy brochures promise paradise, sometimes it's worth looking a little deeper, asking a few more questions, and understanding what risks you might be taking. Because the ocean keeps its secrets well, and not all mysteries on the high seas have happy endings. This has been Mystery on the High Seas, when vacation turns into horror. Thank you for watching.